He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man, the dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Jim Jatras, welcome to Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Jay, great to be here. You come highly recommended. I hope I come likewise highly recommended.
Well, this is one of the fun things about having an interview show that's been running as long as mine, is that at a certain point you cross the threshold where you've sort of reached the maximum number of people you can find organically. And so you can reach out to friends and get recommendations. And so I never encountered your work before being recommended it. And I'm very pleased to have you on the show. It's you sort of get to cheat, right? You sort of get to outsource your guests. So for my audience who might not be familiar with you, well, who are you and what do you do?
Who the hell are you? Why are you here?
Pretty much, yeah.
I'm what they call in Russian a bывший человек, a former person, a person who was formerly something. That was a term that came around after the revolution when people had been something, but they weren't anymore. I'm just very briefly, I grew up in a military family. My father was a fighter pilot. My parents were both born in the United States. All four of my grandparents were from Greece, from Sparta. Grew up in Germany, a lot of places in the United States. Went to law school after undergrad school because I didn't know what else to do. Never practiced law, went from there into the diplomatic service. I was a foreign service officer for about 6.5 years, serving in Mexico, and then later at the Office of Soviet Union Affairs back in those days under the Reagan administration, and the Office of the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. And then I worked on Capitol Hill in the Republican leadership for about 17 years as a foreign policy analyst, writing legislation, analyzing legislation, monitoring floor action, things of that sort, writing papers on policy issues, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, Central America, South Africa, all that fun stuff. And then after I left government service, I was with a couple of major law firms in D.C. as an evil Washington lobbyist for a while, and then also with some smaller boutique firms. And then I retired about 5 years ago as a Virginia country gentleman. And so that's who I am. And I do a lot of talk on, various podcasts. And I used to write quite prolifically. In fact, just to plug my book here, I tried to warn you, my collected writings for the last 5 decades, also useful for home defense. I don't really write anymore. My muse has deserted me, but I can blab like any other idiot online. So I do that sometimes.
Well, yeah, fair enough. I mean, if we're talking about blabbing on the internet, I'm far from the first person to criticize you there. I've made somewhat of a middling online career out of it. So I want to talk with you specifically about U.S.-Russia relations, because effectively my entire life, Russia has been, a bugaboo. I sort of came of age during, the first Trump years where, Russiagate was, the scandal to end all scandals. Now, obviously with the, Russia-Ukraine war, that has continued to be the case, at least for a large, percentage of, America. But I assume that relations between the two countries did not start with the election of Donald Trump. Right. Obviously, there's a dramatic before and after the Cold War. So if you could, as someone who lived through it, can you speak about the transition from, first fighting the Cold War, then to Russia as a nominally regular nation, and how did that lead us to the sort of contentious relationship we have today?
Yeah, I could certainly do that. One thing I want to flag, because I think a lot of people misunderstand this point. I think there are a lot of people, especially younger people, who haven't lived through that history, who simply assume that this is just kind of a carryover or hangover from the first Cold War with the Soviet Union. Well, don't they realize it's not the Soviet Union anymore? It's not communist anymore. Why are we so hostile to Russia? And that isn't it. In fact, we are far, far more hostile to Russia today as a non-communist country than we ever were during the Soviet period, during the depths of the Cold War. I mean, just point, whatever you think of Vladimir Putin personally, no Soviet leader, not Brezhnev, not Khrushchev, not even Stalin, was ever demonized by the American media and the American establishment the way this guy is. And so, this is a qualitatively different thing. Just to back things up a little bit, maybe on a macro level. To start with, Russia and the United States have no particular reason to be enemies. And for that matter, they don't have no particular reason to have any close complementary relationship either. I mean, if there are two countries on the planet that really have no reason to interact with each other for good or ill, it's the United States and Russia. I mean, Russia is a very self-contained country in terms of, its resource base. It supplies everything it needs. If there's a country that could be a perfect autarky, it would be Russia, because they can supply all their needs domestically. The United States isn't quite as in that position, but we're a pretty substantial operation if we were to focus on our own domestic needs rather than trying to project power all across the world. So, we have no reason to be in each other's faces, and we have no reason really to be dependent on each other either. Back during the 19th century, when the major antagonist of both the United States and Russia was the British Empire, we actually had a fairly cordial relationship with Russia. Not that I'm a big Lincoln partisan in the Civil War and so forth, but the reason Russia supported the Union during the Civil War is because the British Empire supported the Confederacy. So they were, they just fought the Crimean War with Russia, and so they inclined toward a strong friendship toward the United States, again, we get in all the details of the revolution, communism, and all that. The long and the short of it is, when we get toward the end of the communist period, when the Soviet government collapsed, when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and communism and Russia stopped being a global movement that was problematic for the United States, I think there was a lot of naivete, at least on my part, that we would go back to a more or less normal world, non-ideological world that existed before 1914. What I did not anticipate is that the United States would embark upon a new career as kind of a new Soviet Union. Instead of, peace, progress, and socialism ideologically, we're going to impose democracy, human rights, and corporate free markets on the rest of the world. And at that time, in the 1990s, when Russia was in chaos, we thought we had Russia under lock and key. We thought we had a puppet government in there with Yeltsin, and we could just expand NATO. We could do anything we wanted. All Russia would do is say, yes, sir, yes, sir. Yeah, how high would you like me to jump, sir? And I think what happened is then when Putin came in, who was, remember, appointed by Yeltsin, we simply assumed he would carry on in that same direction. He didn't. He began to reassert Russian national interests, including their, you might say, their regional security interests. And even worse, and Jay, I think this is something that people need to understand. Even worse, he abandoned communist ideology. I mean, it had already been abandoned in the 1990s, and wanted to build Russia back as a strong national state with something of an Orthodox Christian ethos to it, although it's still officially a secular state. And that was completely unacceptable to the globalist ideology that motivates American global quest for hegemony. That's the fundamental problem between the United States and Russia today, I would say.
Several things there. One, to your point about the sort of pre-Soviet relations. If any of the listeners are fellow gun history aficionados, they'll be well aware of the fact that there was a lively arms trade between the Tsarist regime and Americans, right? Small firms at the time, relatively small firms like Smith and Wesson sent revolvers, the Winchester lever actions, all of these things. Like, there were relatively normal trade relations by the standards of the day. Similarly, when we get to FDR, we have to understand that FDR was very, very soft on the communists. You can read any number of books on this. Garrett and I can't remember the other guy's name on the top of my head, but multiple people wrote about this, kind of the origins of the American old right. But coming up to the the falling of the wall, that moment where the Cold War was over, that reaction you brought up of, oh, we can go back to being a normal country again. We are no longer required to fight this global war, is a common one when you talk to, the paleo conservatives, who, many of whom I'm lucky enough to know, I'm friends with and consider major intellectual influences. It was, all right, we were cold warriors. We engaged in this in good faith. We thought that the issue was communism taking over the world. That is no longer a problem. So now America can be a country again.
Yeah.
And very clearly, the neoconservatives won that. I don't know if they won the debate, but they got to be in charge. And so America became, right, the world police. So you mentioned the sort of, the rise of, Vladimir Putin. I'm just going to start off by saying I'm American enough that I cannot pronounce words from any other language. I apologize to everyone ahead of time. But point is, that sort of transition from, viewing Russia as sort of a potential like lackey or kind of, economic zone for exploitation. We really can't talk about that without talking about George H.W. Bush, and particularly the guarantees, although these have become sort of controversial, the U.S. gave to Russia. Obviously, this becomes relevant with the Russia-Ukraine war. Do you want to explain those a little bit for the listener?
Sure. To start with, but just to something you commented on, and I think should be emphasized that I did miss, is that during the Soviet period, and certainly going all the way back to FDR, there was a very strong, if not sympathy for the Soviet Union, but at least kind of a benign attitude toward, frankly, communism by progressive elements in the West, including in the American establishment. When I was at the Soviet desk in the State Department, I had the reputation, well-deserved, I hope, as being a cross-eyed anti-communist zealot, which I was. My father at the time was the Air Force attaché in Moscow, so we could see the same operation from both sides of the both from the Washington and Moscow standpoint. And my colleagues, generally speaking, had a very benign view of the Soviet Union and communism as such. In fact, they were anti-Russian, but communism was the only good thing about Russia. At least it was progressive and secular. I mean, I remember writing some papers, briefing papers, where I suggested, that non-communist Russia would be a great thing. And they were horrified. I mean, the idea that it would have been better if the whites had won the Civil War rather than the Reds was something, but they were a bunch of fascists or, so on and so forth. That was the attitude at the time. And then, somewhat to my surprise, I guess being a naive fellow, is that when communism fell, I say, well, great. That's wonderful. Russia is back. We can get rid of all that communism. They were horrified. The same people have been very benign toward the Soviet Union as a communist state became very, very anti-Russian. So, again, I don't think we can underestimate the extent to which this progressive globalist, essentially godless mindset that dominates the thinking of all the establishments in the Western countries, a huge part of this antipathy toward Russia. That's all. But they also hate people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and so forth, because they want to build a strong national state and even a Christian society, not one that shares their worship the sacred rainbow flag values. So there's a huge part of that. Now back to what you said about George Bush. George Bush the elder. I would not make him out to be the major culprit here at all. I think he did give those assurances, and I think he probably gave them in good faith. Now, he probably assumed that meant, and remember, he was the guy who coined the phrase, the New World Order. Maybe he is the one who thought that, okay, fine, we'll just pull Russia in as another satellite like the rest of Europe, and everything will be well after that. But he did give those assurances. Maybe he didn't think it was necessary to expand NATO. It was actually Bill Clinton who, of course, pursued the first round of NATO expansion. And he did so apparently largely for American domestic political reasons. Back then, it seems quaint to say so now, back then, Illinois was actually in play for American presidential elections. And he was told, hey, if you promise expansion of NATO to include Poland, you'll get all the Polish votes in Chicago and you can carry Illinois. So he said, that was a good idea. I don't even think he even thought that through. And he kind of figured, well, the Russians are flat on their backs. They can't object to it anyway. So that went forward. The real big crunch actually was not under Bill Clinton or under Bush the elder. It was under Bush the younger. because under him, that's when you really had the neocons in the saddle, the same people that brought us into the Iraq War in 2003. And that's when we had the Big Bang expansion in 2004. And I remember I was working at the Senate this time. There was a lot of, by the way, there was a lot of opposition to the first round of NATO expansion back in 1996. There were about 10 left-wing Democrats and 10 right-wing Republicans who opposed the first round of NATO expansion. When that was just Czechia, Hungary, and Poland. When the second round went in for Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, the Baltic states, there was no opposition at all. They were already firmly in the saddle. We're going to do this. NATO will be the security guarantee in Europe. And if the Russians don't like it, they can lump it. And remember, too, Vladimir Putin at that time wasn't necessarily opposed to any of that. In fact, he even contacted, as early as Bill Clinton, well, Russia would be interested in joining NATO as well. What do you think about that? And Clinton replied, well, yeah, that should be possible. And then, of course, he went back and talked to his advisors, and they said, oh, no way, Jose, we're going to let Russia into NATO. They're the object of NATO expansion. They're not a participant. And that's when things, I think, really started to go off the rails with the Russians. Even then, it took the Russians a long time to wake up and smell the coffee. And I think what really, really crunched it for them were two things. One was the bombing of Serbia in 1999, when I can remember Russians saying to me, anti-communist Russians, for all these years, we never believed all the things the communists said about you, about how aggressive you were. Now we know that were all true. So that's the first thing. The second thing was in 2008. This is something I was very involved with in opposing it, because I was working for the bishop, the Serbian Orthodox Bishop of Kosovo at that time, opposing American policy on Kosovo. And when we pushed through the claim that Kosovo was becoming an independent state in 2008 against a Security Council, because one of the things that when the Russians would object to what you were talking about the expansion of NATO, well, George Bush promised you we wouldn't expand NATO, and the answer was, should have gotten writing. Well, in 1999, they did get in writing in a Security Council resolution that Kosovo, even after the NATO aggression, that Kosovo would remain an autonomous province of Serbia. It's right there in 1244, the Security Council resolution. And the Russians say, okay, we got in writing this time. And the Americans said, yeah, well, we don't care. Rip. We're going to do it anyway. And that's when they realized, okay, all bets are off. And then, of course, in the same year, 2008, they said, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And that's when they realized, okay, that's when we passed. In a way, that's when we passed the point of no return. That's when the Russians said, okay, we can't trust these people. We have to prepare self-help measures of our own. That's when they began their military buildup. That's when they began to say red line in the sand. And of course, the thing that signaled that was the short war in Georgia in 2008, when Saakashvili, the president at the time, launched an attack on the Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia, killed a number of them, and the Russians felt they had to respond. And so, that's when the real shift came. I'm sorry, I'm sort of throwing this out there in a fog, but it's something that sort of progressed through these stages.
So I want to pull back the timeline just a little bit to talk about the global war on terror, because if I'm correct, Russia was very accommodating to our response. Also, as far as I understand, Putin was very gracious in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks.
Oh, yeah.
So the idea that this has been, this sort of like mutual antipathy forever just doesn't hold up water at all. There were, many actions in good faith saying, here, we will give you this gift. We will let you use our air bases to conduct this, ultimately ill-conceived invasion, but, that's neither here nor there. It was, nonetheless sort of a gift. And I'm glad you brought up the action in Serbia, because it's interesting the way in which every one of America's enemies is sort of continually recast as Hitler. You have obviously Slobodan Milosevic as Hitler.
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein was Hitler, and now we have Putler, right? The sort of stupid portmanteau of the Russian and the Austrian. Right?
Vladov Putler.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that I have often thought about is certainly there is a, the kind of general globalist antipathy to, a national state acting in its own self-interest, particularly one
Yeah.
kind of leaning towards, Christianity. But also, and, I don't like to cast aspersions on someone based off of their, ethnic background. But it is awfully suspicious that there are a lot of Ukrainians or former Ukrainians in the State Department who seem to really have an axe to grind
Yeah.
with Russia. Am I accurate in pointing that out?
Oh yeah. Well, again, to tie it all together, back again, you're not old enough to remember this, but back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were these ethnic lobbies in the United States that marketed themselves as anti-communists, but what they really were the World War II Losers Association. There were Hungarians, West Ukrainians, Poles. I mean, the Poles were sort of a mixed bag in terms of how they came out of World War II. They actually came out pretty well. They lost their eastern part, which was largely Ukrainian and Belarusian ethnically, but they gained a lot of former German territory, where the Germans cleared out. So it didn't work out all that badly for them, although, of course, they suffered horrendously during the war. The long and the short of it is these people did not like the borders that were drawn in Eastern Europe and Central Europe after World War II. They wanted to go back basically to the borders that existed in 1943 under German occupation. And if you look at a map in 1943 and the map that emerged after the wars in the 1990s, yeah, there's a lot of similarities there. Very different from the map that existed from 1945 to the 1990s. Yeah, so you did it, and the thing is, and this is where we get into American politics too. Most Americans, if you will, WASPs, ethnic Americans, people with no hyphen, attached to them, are very naive when it comes to ethnicity, religion, all these other markers of identity. If you have a bunch of people with, Eastern European names that are saying, oh, yeah, we're anti-communist and we want to fight the Soviet Union, they said, yeah, great, we're there with us. It doesn't even occur to them. They just have ethnic axes to grind, that they just want to have their own ethnic states enlarged at the expense of the people who are their historic enemies. That was a huge part of this. So, yeah, you do have obviously a lot of people with those ethnic backgrounds who say, hey, if we can get the Americans on board to, call the people we don't like and their leader Hitler, we can go get them to put sanctions on and bomb for our behalf and reimpose our borders from 1943. The other thing, of course, is very controversial, you have a huge Jewish element among the neoconservatives. They've got their own ethnic axis to crime. I still remember one of my Jewish colleagues at the State Department back in the 1980s. We're talking about Poles and Russians and Ukrainians and Germans and all that. And his answer was, well, as far as I'm concerned, Germans, Poles, and Russians all deserve each other. Now, I don't think he was saying that as an American. I think he was saying that projecting his own ethnic points of view. And of course, this is also where you get into, the huge kind of, Trotskyite element in the neoconservative movement, back to Max Schachtman back in the 1930s, Social Democrats USA, and all these people that flooded in, starting really with the Reagan administration, but really coming into their own in the Bush, the younger administration, basically running the place. And of course, they have their own ethnic axes to grind. They also have their ideological hangover, from Trotsky against Stalin. That is part of the way they look at the world. And unfortunately, again, most Americans haven't got a clue about this stuff. They just think, oh, yeah, they're standing up for a strong America. Oh, yeah, they're fighting communism. They have no idea what any of this stuff is about. And they didn't in those days. That's one reason they can be so influential.
Well, I mean, to that point, in a much more innocuous version, you see this with, Armenians in the U.S. They have a powerful ethnic lobby, and they're always constantly trying to get different states and municipalities to, recognize the Armenian genocide. And like, look, I'm not a big fan of Turks. I imagine, given your ethnic and religious background, you probably aren't either. But to be perfectly honest,
every Turk I've known has been simply delightful, but that's a whole other story.
Fair enough. But to be honest, I literally do not see how it matters in the slightest what the city of Jacksonville, Florida thinks about a genocide that happened 110 years ago, literally across the planet.
Yeah, but here's an interesting thing. I mean, as you've pointed out, that was always the holy grail for the Armenian lobby, which is a very substantial lobby, although not as powerful as people think it is. And certainly they're on their back foot now. I mean, they've got nothing right now in Washington right now, especially since there's an American puppet, Pashinyan, as the prime minister there. He's just a quisling. He's just the worst. But that's a whole nother topic. For years and years and years, they wanted to get that genocide resolution through the Congress, and they couldn't do it because it was not only opposed by the Turkish lobby, which doesn't have a big ethnic lobby in the United States, but they do have a lot of support from the national security apparatus because Turkey buys a lot of military equipment. They've got a lot of, clout there. But their big ace in the hole was the Israeli lobby, because for a lot of the period of the post-World War II into the Cold War period, Turkey and Israel were like this because Turkey was a Kemalist, secular, anti-Islamic power, and they were a big part of Israel's strategy in the region. Well, that all ended with Erdogan, when Erdogan as an Islamist comes to power, and of course the Israelis and the Turks don't really get along anymore, and the Israelis turned on, because the reason they didn't want that resolution going through was, one, they didn't want to offend their ally Turkey, and two, they had that little copyright marker on the word genocide. They didn't want anybody else have it. Well, as soon as Erdogan came to power, they switched sides, and that resolution went right through the Congress like nothing because the Israelis were now supporting it rather than opposing it.
Yeah, and the reason I brought that up is, I have no particularly strong opinions on Armenians, but you see the same thing. When you are an international empire, when you control the world, everyone's ethnic problems become your problem,
yes,
one way or another.
Yeah,
and
also you can manipulate them. I mean, if your goal is as what Bill Kristol and Bob Kagan pointed out in a 1996 article, their goal should be American global hegemony forever. That's our goal, to rule. We keep hearing Hitler wanted to rule the world. Well, we do want to rule the world. That's how we've gotten to this juncture. That's why we've got not only this situation with the Russians in Eastern Europe, but we got the situation with Iran. We're going to have a war with China, in 5 years, according to a lot of people, the way they're talking. We want to rule the world. You have the Anglo-American, if you will, or Anglo-Israel-American thalassocratic global empire against the kind of the Eurasian bloc, which is Russia, China, Iran, and a few other countries, and a few outliers like Venezuela. That's the situation we've got ourselves into. And I don't see much of any way out of it. And you're right. This Hitler of the month, I guess Maduro is now the new Hitler of the month. Saddam Hussein was, Assad was, Milosevic was. By the way, I testified as a defense witness in Milosevic's trial at The Hague. What can I say, Jay? It's all lies. It's all lies. And basically, they lie. They lie like Bolsheviks, because essentially they are Bolsheviks.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely something to that. I mean, I don't want to turn this into a discussion about Venezuela, but very clearly the narrative being presented to us in the mainstream media about Venezuela is complete and total nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and look, okay, is invading Venezuela a mistake on the order of magnitude of invading Afghanistan? Okay, maybe not, but that is not a great justification for doing anything, right?
We'll find out when it happens, I guess. It may turn out to be an even bigger mistake. We don't know.
So I want to continue with our narrative on, the U.S. and Russia, and move up to sort of the mid 2010s, right? The kind of end of the Obama era, which is, I think, the first time that many Americans, myself included, became aware of the fact that Ukraine was not a part of Russia, right? That it was its own country, and that there was, a border dispute going on between, the Ukraine and Russia. And I have a very, actually, I've probably tipped my hand by saying the Ukraine. They're all mad at me already. But I remember very distinctly, I was on a plane as a teenager, and I remember there was a Ukrainian woman speaking to some colleague directly in front of me, just all upset about this dispute, just horribly offended, the U.S. needs to go in. So could you provide a little bit of context on, the kind of initial, I guess, armed conflicts in, the 2014 era?
But I think again, this takes a little backup. I mean, you say, Ukrainians being very offended, et cetera, et cetera. How do I put this? The difference between Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians is essentially like the difference between, Saxons, Bavarians, and Prussians, who are basically all Germans, or for that matter, Austrians. The difference between a Bavarian and an Austrian is virtually zero. I mean, the difference between a Bavarian and a Prussian is much greater than the difference between a Bavarian and an Austrian in terms of language, religion, history, and so forth. The fact that there is a Ukrainian state is essentially, came into existence in 1991, is essentially an accident of history caused by the way the Bolsheviks drew lines within the Soviet Union, during the communist era. There never has been a Ukrainian state, a viable Ukrainian state in history. And it only came into existence because of the way the Soviet Union happened to fall apart in 1991. The Russians accepted that. They basically said, to think of it in terms of, say, well, suppose if when Germany was defeated in World War II, not only was Austria made into a separate country again, suppose they said, okay, Bavaria is now going to become a separate country too. Actually, Bavaria does have a history of being a separate kingdom under the Wittelsbach dynasty. But the Russian attitude toward that was fairly copacetic. Well, okay, Ukrainians are essentially another kind of Russian, in the broad sense. They're all Rus, so to speak, based on historical and religious and other circumstances. But now they have a separate state. They never had one before, but they have one now. It's kind of a very, what's the word I want? Incoherent state, in the sense that you have a lot of people in it that never really consider themselves Ukrainians, except that's the way the Soviet Union drew the lines. But hey, we can live with that as long as it's, as long as, we're all getting along with everybody in Europe, everybody in the West. NATO is not threatening us. When NATO began to threaten them by expansion, that became a concern. And then when in 2008, the NATO, the North Atlantic Council declared that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO, that's when the Russians drew the line. And even at the time, William Burns, who just was Biden's CIA director, was the ambassador in Moscow at the time. He wrote a memo back to Washington that said, "Niet means niet, no means no. They will not accept this." And even at that, they were not willing to pull it back. I mean, because of their mania for global domination and putting Russia in a position where it simply could not defend itself, where we would be able to fatally compromise their national security by bringing Ukraine into NATO and building up a NATO force there and putting NATO weapons into Ukraine. They didn't care about that. They were simply, playing chess on the board. We will put Russia in this position, force them back into the satellite status they had under Yeltsin in the 1990s, and eventually, I would say, break Russia up into smaller pieces that are more easily digestible. So that's where that's where Ukraine became essentially what I would call an attractive nuisance. It became a football or a platform where we could then expand our anti-Russia policy in a way that fatally compromised Russian security. And they thought they could get away with it. I mean, that's why we had two revolutions, not just the Orange Revolution in 2004, and that when that really didn't pan out and it fizzled, and then Yanukovych, who, by the way, I worked for back as a lobbyist back in 2003 to 2005, when he was prime minister of Ukraine, and then a presidential candidate, that they when he then won the election in 2010, and everybody said, "Oh, he's pro-Russian." He wasn't. He was actually somebody who wanted to maintain this neutral position for Ukraine, because he realized Ukraine is such a divided country. If it attempted to go to either one camp or the other, the Western camp or the Russian camp, it would tear the country apart, which is precisely what happened. So he was always insistent, no, Ukraine must be a bridge, not a wall. It must be a bridge between East and West. When he was overthrown in the Maidan Revolution in 2014, he was overthrown because he wanted modifications, not even a rejection, but modifications on a trade deal with the European Union that would utterly devastated Ukrainian industry, especially in the eastern part of the country, which was his electoral base. And also because what he wanted and also what the Russians wanted, to say, well, look, if you're going to have a trade relationship between Ukraine and the EU, why not make it a three-way negotiation between Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union so we could have one big trade pact that accommodates everybody, both East and West, and also has Ukraine in a position to have a relationship with both blocs. That was unacceptable to the West. They said, no, you must take the Western path. No other path is possible for you. Yanukovych says, well, we can't do that. Well, then we'll overthrow you, which is what we did.
And that's one of the, and again, I'm not I would not consider myself a Russophile. To me, I view Putin as someone who is got the interest of his country at heart, which I admire, but his country is not my country.
Correct.
So,
yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I've really grown to resent Ukraine, really because of the last several years, and a large part of that is the bizarre insistence of the sacredness of, not the correct form of that word, we'll go with it, of Ukrainian democracy. The idea that this is some perfect Western style political system, and obviously you have what you've just mentioned, this sort of back and forth revolutions and counter revolutions over the past 10 years, but also the fact that Ukraine is horribly corrupt and persecuting Christians. So if you could you speak to a little bit to the kind of corruption of the Ukrainian government? I mean, obviously there's been a big reveal on that relatively recently, but also the anti-Christian, I mean, to be honest, if it were a different group, we might use the term pogrom.
Yeah. There were two fatal flaws, maybe three if you count geography, but two fatal flaws of Ukraine when it became an independent state. One, as we mentioned, was the sort of the diversity of the country. People in it who had really nothing in common in terms of how they interpreted their identity. You had people in the East that were basically Russians, people in the West, far West especially, there were Ukrainian nationalists, people in between that are sort of mushy. They didn't even agree on what Ukraine was. You had that. But as you point out, the corruption. I mean, just like Russia in the 1990s was controlled, basically the whole socialist property of the Soviet Union that in theory belonged to everybody, but really belonged to the state, became just was shamelessly looted by various oligarchs who found themselves in control with vast amounts of wealth. That was true in Russia. Putin has largely brought those people under control, but it was certainly true in Ukraine and continues to be true today, where basically the state is very weak and these oligarchic interests treat the state as their plaything for enriching themselves and holding on and using their wealth to buy political power. And that's the condition that Ukraine has always been in. And the level of corruption, and let's face it, not only just under this regime, but any of the previous governments, was shameless. I mean, enough to make a Nigerian prince blush. I mean, it's just the worst. And that continues to be true now. As far as the church situation goes, this is again where the United States, a lot of people tend to be rather dismissive of religion as a geopolitical force. I mean, as people like Jay Dyer, for example, have pointed out, that the United States has a very long history of using religion as a tool of influence, going back to the World Council of Churches, the CIA's very close relationship with people in the Vatican, and also in the Fanar, which is the headquarters of the Church of Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarchate in the Orthodox world. They saw an opportunity to split, not only politically split Ukraine from Russia, but also spiritually to split Ukraine from Russia. Because one of the things that really binds Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians and Moldovans and frankly, Serbs and Bulgarians and Greeks and other people is their common Orthodox faith. How do you do that? Well, there are in many countries small schismatic groups that are not in communion with, the established, recognized canonical church. And there are a couple of groups like that in Ukraine. And what the United States did in concert with the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is strongly under American influence, is to say, well, let's take a couple of these small splinter groups and recognize them as the legitimate Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and take the canonical church and de-recognize them and call them schismatics and pro-Russian agents, and then have the state come in and crush them, seize their property, arrest their priests, and try to transfer all of that property to the new church that we've created and called the canonical church. So that's what's going on. You have a state-supported church based on some really marginal splinter group figures that have now been elevated by the state to the official church, while the real church, which is the majority of the population, is being crushed simply by police and mob methods, where they send people into the church, they lock up the church, throw the parishioners out, turn it over to the new body that they recognize. Very often the church then simply stays locked or unused because there are no parishioners or clergy to serve that church anymore, and the real parishioners are forced to hold services in private houses or in the forest, things that they used to do back under the Bolsheviks. The priests are arrested. They're sometimes drafted into the army. There was one case of a father, what was his name, Mikola, who was drafted, sent to the army, and was thereafter killed on the front. Maybe he was just shot down by the Ukrainian authorities. We don't really know. There are a couple of bishops who are in jail. So this is basically a campaign against the church that is recognized by almost all of the Orthodox world, except for a couple of jurisdictions like Constantinople that are under strong American influence. And again, in fact, there'll be a day on Capitol Hill coming up here on December 16th. I'll be participating in where we'll be going to congressional offices, trying to highlight what our government is supporting over there, which is, against, by the way, I was one of the authors of the International Religious Freedom Act back in the 1990s. That tried to highlight religious freedom as an element of American policy. Unfortunately, it simply became another tool by which we can manipulate affairs abroad and say, oh, we support religious freedom. Ukraine should have their own church. Well, it's really this fake church that's manufactured for political reasons.
I mean, it's somewhat ridiculous hypothetical, but if you can imagine a sort of Red Dawn situation, right, where the Cubans take over America, and then they, instantiate the Westboro Baptist Church as the only legitimate religious organization.
Yeah.
It would be absurd, right? Clearly,
no
one would go to, very few people would, and again, right, it's just sort of slightly.
The FEI goes over to Liberty University, shuts it down, and puts the Westboro people in charge of it and says, this is the now legitimate Baptist church in Lynchburg,
maybe it's a funny idea.
Let's not give them ideas.
Yeah, let's stick that in the back pocket. That's sort of a situation of it might be funny enough to be worth it. But anyway, in sort of a more serious note, one of the other things that has obviously been a result of this conflict has been a massive exodus from the country. Some of this is draft dodging, but another part of it is women and children fleeing a war zone. Even a relatively surgical war is still dangerous, right? There's nothing to be really done about that. And so what do you see as the future for Ukraine? Like, assuming that, if it were possible, we could freeze the conflict line, put some sort of DMZ, what becomes of the nation? Because in my mind, very regrettably, it seems to be ruined, genuinely, just completely ruined.
Yeah, at the time Ukraine became independent in 1991, it was probably the most wealthy on a per capita basis of all the former Soviet republics. If not it was pretty close to the top. It had something around 50 million, maybe slightly more than 50 million people in it within its 1991 borders. That fell off, like a lot of the former Soviet and other socialist republics in Eastern Europe, fell rather markedly following independence, because a lot of people at that point, they saw greener pastures in the West and they left. And so you already had some falling off from Ukraine. So it was under 50 million when Yanukovych became president. He campaigned on, 50 million Ukrainians as one of his campaign themes. If I understand the rumors correctly, he personally was trying to contribute to that as much as possible. As is not atypical for politicians in this part of the world. But when this war started, okay, let's keep in mind, Crimea was taken by the Russians, the Eastern Oblast. So you probably have right there several million people that were no longer in part of Ukraine controlled by the Kiev regime. A lot of people leaving. You have, if you listen to people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, we'd probably have something like 1.8 million Ukrainian soldiers that have been killed in this war, which is, I mean, that's a substantial chunk of a population. I'd be surprised if there's still 20 million people left in the part of Ukraine that the Kiev regime controls. How many are in the Russian-controlled area? I don't really know. Probably 5 to 7 million, something like that. I mean, Ukraine, and now it's apparently their birth rate. I mean, as you know, you need like 2.2, 2.3 babies per woman to keep even a level population, much less grow. I think there's something like 0.93 or something like that. They are below 1%. I mean, one child per woman now in terms of replacement. And by the way, just to digress, I saw a debate between Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis and General Ben Hodges recently, and Hodges says, well, they have to keep fighting. There are 2 million Ukrainian men and women that still can be put into the army and fight this war. I say, what kind of maniac wants to send not only more men into this meat grinder, but wants to send women in too? I mean, if you're trying to kill off any demographic potential in this place, that's certainly the way to do it. The Russians, and I've been very critical of this. Let's cut to the chase. The only way this war can end is in a Russian victory. The Russians cannot lose this war because it would be fatal for them from their security point of view. For them, this is an existential war. They must win this war no matter what happens, no matter what the West throws at them, and they will one way or the other. The trouble is they don't seem to want to do it in a look. We saw how the Israelis decapitated Hezbollah. They tried to decapitate the Iranian government. The Russians, for whatever reasons, are not doing anything to try to decapitate the Kiev regime. I mean, they basically have not struck at the presidential administration, the SBU, which is the Ukrainian KGB, the military intelligence, the Rada, which is the parliament. They haven't done any of that stuff. Instead, their policy is one of killing as many Ukrainian soldiers at the front as possible as a way to demilitarize Ukraine. And I think they hope force the other side to cry uncle. If they keep killing more Ukrainian soldiers at the front, keep taking more territory, the other side will finally cry uncle, say, okay, fine, we'll agree to your terms. I don't think that's going to happen. So you say, what's the future for Ukraine? Right now, its future is continued depopulation by basically killing off all their manpower. As Andrei Martyanov calls it, we're going to kill off Ukraine's sperm bank. Well, that, even if they're not, as they're falsely accused of doing, bombing civilian areas, terrorizing civilians, even if they're not doing that, they're still killing an awful lot of Ukrainians who are in uniform. Okay, fine, they're military targets. This is war. I understand that. But they are depopulating Ukraine, certainly on the male side, almost basically very close to what happened to all the European countries in World War I, where you look at the demographic chart and you see that big notch on the male side where all those men died during World War I, and you see a second notch further down where all the children, where those men would have fathered, didn't get born. Well, that's what's happening to Ukraine now, and that is the Russian policy. I think is based on a very bad political calculus of thinking that if they inflict enough pain on Ukraine, their Western sponsors will finally give up. And I don't think they will. And in fact, as we see from Europe every day, they're actually preparing for war with Russia. And I think, unfortunately, as long as this war keeps going, that war becomes more and more likely.
Certainly. Look, as someone who sort of has, my personal background in, political realism, the Italian elite theorists, I understand that, look, we live in a fallen world. Human politics is a nasty and dangerous game. I understand that. Mm-hmm. But there is something I do find personally morally affronting about this war. It bothers me on a like a spiritual level almost. And the case of Irina Zarutska is sort of the perfect exemplification of that. That this is someone whose country has been entirely destroyed to feed this sort of godless satanic globalist empire. This woman has been displaced across the world. Yeah, done what she's supposed to do. Right, gotten a job. Started some semblance of a life, And that empire, which is nominally American, is so uninterested in running the country named America in any sort of way that this woman is hacked to death by someone who should have been executed decades ago. And to me, and you hear this often in, we could broadly call it kind of non-interventionist circles, but we'll take this slur on, is the idea that either the American empire survives or the American nation survives. You can only pick one.
Yeah.
And to me, the fact that our leaders are choosing the empire over the nation, casting themselves as humanitarians while pushing an entire country, which admittedly, I'll be honest, I don't care about Ukraine deeply. It's not a country that I have any sort of attachment to, but they are human beings. It is a Christian European nominal country.
Yeah.
And to see that being fed into a meat grinder, and for what? The country there's no possible way that they will maintain the borders that, were pre-existing before this war. It's pointless. And sure, it may buy, a certain number of McMansions and, a few counties in Northern Virginia that might be helpful for someone. But to me, that's the part that I just find just completely unconscionable.
Oh, it is. I referred to my colleague at the State Department who said the Germans, the Poles, and the Russians all deserve each other. I'm sure you've heard some people look back at World War II and said, what we should have done is just let the Soviets and the Nazis fight each other and kill off as many Germans and Russians as we can. And that would have been to our benefit, which is a really horrible thought when you think about it. I mean, you look at the demographic catastrophe that Europe suffered in World War I. And then you want to give it another round in World War II, which is what happened. In retrospect, that may have turned out to have been fatal for European Christian civilization, not only spiritually, but even demographically, the way things are going. And I can't help but feel that there are some people that are looking at this, as they say, fight to the last Ukrainian and kill as many Russians as possible. Hey, look, even if 10 Ukrainians are dying, to kill every one Russian, even if it's that lopsided, at least we're killing that one Russian. So let's keep this going as long as possible. The more Ukrainians and Russians who die, the better it is for us. I think there are people who think that way. I think that's the people who have that point of view. And then why do they do it? Well, what you said earlier, maintain the American global empire at all costs. And as I said, this war is certainly existential for Russia on a national security point of view, because they have a very sober idea of their national security. Their own borders to start with, their near abroad, their immediate region next after that, then European and Eurasian affairs, and then finally global affairs. The United States has the exact bass-ackwards way of looking at the world, where the last thing on our agenda is our own national security in our own region, but rather we look at our vital national security interests in the South China Sea, or in the Middle East, or in Eastern Europe, places that have nothing to do with the United States, ignore the welfare, the prosperity, the security of the American people, both domestically. Well, one thing I'll give credit for to Trump, at least he seems to have tightened up the border situation, which is something, very, very important. So let's not neglect that. But historically, that's been one of the least concerns of the American national security perspective, which, is far more concerned about the borders in the Balkans or in the Middle East than they are concerned about the American border. So I think you're absolutely right on that point. And I think that ultimately boils down to a pathology, back to what I was referring to earlier about the American ruling ethos, that they've got this very ideological way of looking at the world, where America is kind of like what the Soviet Union was for the Bolsheviks, a platform for global domination. It's a base from which to spread their malign, anti-human, anti-Christian ideology over the entire world. And that the American people are just sort of the drones who are supposed to pay for it. That's great. That's all they see us as. We're just cogs in a machine.
Well, and I think as well that sort of crusade, Anti-Fascism, the Career of a Concept by Gottfried goes into this.
Yeah.
Where he describes the genesis of the American empire. It's really, it's funny. I think I stole this from James Lindsay, of all people, who really doesn't like me, which I consider sort of a badge of honor. But he spoke about how the the French are kind enough to number their republics. And so you understand that, it's
Right.
the same thing, but there's
Yeah.
a major change. We've sort of had the same thing in America, right?
Mhm.
There's multiple different nations sort of
Mhm.
stacked on top of each other.
Mhm.
And the current instantiation is very much the house that FDR built. If nothing else, I consider myself to be an arch FDR hater forever. And one of the things that you see in that, and Gottfried points this out, is that he created this sort of ideological crusade against fascism. Right?
Mhm.
That was the big
Yeah.
evil.
Yeah.
And so you see this in American media, from the Cold War covering
Mhm.
Russia. It's like, well, you have Ivan Drago. And it's like, well, let's be honest, the
Mhm.
6'6", blonde, blue-eyed super soldier.
Yeah.
Is that a particularly, Russian figure? Or is it, the peaked hat and it's basically, the fascists all over again, but we put a Russian flag behind them? And I think that's part of
Yeah.
where you
Yeah.
see the kind of, goofy painting of everyone as Hitler. He's sort of the Satan in our horrible, godless
Yeah.
civic religion.
Vladimir
But
Putin. Yeah.
But additionally, right, that idea of this eternal crusade
Mhm.
of like, wherever this evil is, we need to
Yeah.
go fight it, no matter how far or, unrelated to, America as a nation state.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so clearly pointless. And I'm glad, well, not pointless for us, I guess, but I'm glad you brought up that term ideology, because I think that that's sort of one of the interesting things that I notice when people talk about
Mhm.
Russia is that I fundamentally view Putin as a post-ideological figure.
Mhm.
Like, to me, there's no, and it sounds dumb to say it, but there's no Putlerism. They're like, you can't even come up with a term for it.
Mm-mm.
And I think that, really the 20th century was the century of ideology, and it was the most bloody century in human history.
Exactly.
And so, to me, it just seems that this is an entirely destructive urge to have this sort of totalizing system that will
Mhm.
save the world,
Yeah.
so to speak. Hopefully we shed it before it completely ruins the country. But I'm not exactly optimistic about that.
No, I think you put your finger on it. This is something I have written about quite a bit, and it's in my book, is that a lot of Americans, especially conservatives, you ask them what America is, they give you all this proposition nation crap and an experiment or whatever it is, and they've lost the notion that we're a country, and not just a civic state, but an ethnic state. I mean, why are we speaking English? This country was founded by Englishmen. Okay, my ancestors were not English, unless some member of the Varangian Guard got a little frisky 1,000 years ago in the.
I mean, who knows? Tennyson, I think, was it Tennyson, or was it another one of the poets that fought in one of your wars in Greece?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, no, Byron, Lord Byron.
Byron, yeah. And if anyone was leaving a genetic legacy in Greece, it would have been Byron.
Yeah. Well, remember, we had Anglo-Saxon refugees from Hastings down there 1,000 years ago serving in the Imperial Guard. So one never knows, do one. I haven't taken a DNA test, but one of the things I try to focus on, especially as somebody not of Anglo-Saxon origin, is the ethnic factor in American identity. Is that because if you ask Americans, oh, well, my Constitution, my democracy, no, that's not what makes America America. Those are epiphenomena of an ethnic state. Those are English folkways, if you will. And and one of the things I like to point out is three phenomena, three ethnic phenomena and three constitutional phenomena. One is the English Civil War has been fought three times. Once in England in the 1640s, once at the time of the American Revolution, which was really our first Civil War here. Everybody keeps referring to our second Civil War. Actually, no, this would be our third, because our first one was in the 1770s and 80s. And of course, then the late unpleasantness in the 1860s. We've had three constitutions in this country under the guise of one document. I'm not counting the Articles of Confederation. From 1789 to 1865, we had what was supposed to be a confederal republic, and then roughly for 100 years after that, we had what you might call a federal democracy. And then I would even go beyond FDR. I would say that in the post-World War II period, that federal democracy degenerated into a consolidated unitarian state run by corporate interests and ethnic interests and international aspirations. it is not even a federal democracy anymore. And it is much of a fiction as democracy was under the Soviet Constitution. Let's not kid ourselves. Except instead of having one party that rules everything, we have, quote, two parties that are in collusion with one another to keep everybody else out. And that's where we are right now. And the thing is, and it gets back to what you're saying, if America is to survive, I don't mean the American Republic. That's gone. The American Republic, the American Constitutional Republic is gone. The question is, will the American ethnos survive? Will the American people basically, white, Christian, English-speaking people as the core ethnos that makes the United States the United States still survive? I mean, the Russians like to talk about, oh, Russia, we have 100 different nationalities, blah, 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 which is true. But what makes it Russia is the fact that there's an Orthodox Russian-speaking core, which is the nucleus of the state, in the same way that, French-speaking people are the nucleus of France, not Bretons, not Basques, not Corsicans, not Alsatian, French-speaking people. So, we've lost sight of that. If you ask your typical American who you are, as I said, he'll talk about Constitution, democracy. He won't say, well, because I'm ethnically an American. I'm an American. I'm nothing else but an American. Now some of them always say, well, because I'm white. They'll look at it in just crude racial terms. But white race is not an ethnos. I mean, it takes language, religion, values. I mean, all those things are a common descent, obviously. But all those other factors are what make a nation a nation. Americans have almost completely lost sight of that, and that's why I don't think the future bodes well for us. I mean, I'm actually in some ways more optimistic about Europe than I am about America, because at least in Italy, there are Italians who know they're Italian. There are Germans who know they're Germans, French who know they're French. Most Americans have no idea who the hell we are.
Well, and that exact point is really why I spend so much time attacking the people who Charles Haywood has termed the catamite right, which is a rude term, but one I'll continue to use, is exactly that. It's like, well, is America an idea that can be exported in any context?
Yeah.
Are, the Liberians who have our constitution the exact same as we are? Or is it a home for a people? Is America a place for a group called Americans? And I'm glad you brought up the distinction between ethnos and race, because there is a difference. And look, in certain situations, when you're applying to college and they say, whitey need not apply, well, that becomes a very relevant factor.
Sure,
and I think that, regardless of your moral opinions on it, I'm not necessarily super hot on it. White identity politics are coming to America one way or another, given current realities. But even in ethnos, and I talk to a lot of Brits, I like them quite a bit. And genetically, I am British. My family's been here, in somewhat inauspicious circumstances, but, since the early 17th century. And so, but even then, right, there's a difference between a Brit and I. You've talked to a number of them, and it's like, well, we look similar, but we're different. And we're probably closer to cousins than anything else, where, there is an overlap there. But fundamentally, there is a difference. And the idea that you see parroted from conservatives that, the Constitution is what matters. De Maistre blew this out of the water, hundreds of years ago, where he said, look, like a Constitution is a reflection of a people at a given time. It has no magical inherent powers. And so to me, really, I view my primary political enemies, at least in this context, as the sort of, intellectual children of, the neoconservatives, the people who, view the purpose of America is to export, all the buzzwords, freedom, democracy, Americanism, right? We can call it that, over the entire world, while letting the people who belong here, who have no other place to go, rot. And so to me, that really is in my mind, that is the fight worth fighting. But Jim, this has been a great interview. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate your time. Do you want to conclude, and then we can tell people where to find you?
Sure. All I can say, Jay, is I find some small degree of encouragement in hearing you talk like this, because if you are aware of these things, hopefully there are other young people who are aware of them. I mean, look, I'm an old guy, my shelf life is going to expire in the not too distant future, I suppose. And let's face it, in some ways, the boomers are the worst when it comes to having messed all this up. Although, frankly, generations they can't come after us are not anything to write home about either. So, because after all, we raised you guys. So, if you guys are screwed up, well, too bad for you. But I'm hopeful, and I'm somewhat hopeful that as this all comes unraveled one way or the other, that more people will get their heads screwed on straight. Hopefully, young men first, and at some point, maybe the chicks will follow after, as hopefully they tend to do. But one never knows. I mean, one of the upsetting things in this country, again, gets back to demographics, is just how low the marriage rates are in all Western countries, including the United States, and the childbearing rates. We have this divergence in politics where a lot of young men are moving to the right, a lot of young women are moving to the left. I mean, one of the worst things you see in voting patterns is that the higher the lower the marriage rate, the more women vote left, which becomes then a kind of a irrevocable rolling tendency in the way the direction of society is going. The long and the short of it is, we ain't voting our way out of this. And at this point, the future of America and the future of the world are intimately bound up, just as the internal stability of the Soviet Union was inextricably tied to the global communist movement. The future of America as a country and Americans as an ethnos is inextricably tied to the future of the American empire. Back to what you said, for America to survive, Americans to survive, the empire must die. And the question is, can it die peacefully the way the Soviet empire died? Can two miracles happen during the same lifetime, where some big, huge going concern of an ideological nature happens to die in a relatively peaceful way without a big bang? Or does it happen with a big bang? I mean, people talk, I think people have a sense of foreboding. A lot of people have a sense of foreboding that something really bad is in our future, whether it's another, pandemic, or whether it's some big financial collapse, and we get plunged into, like, not only a Great Depression or 2008 on steroids, or maybe a global war. And that's always one of the options for the kind of people we're talking about who run things. But I can't escape the notion that some huge dislocation of our lives is going to come about in the not too distant future. I mean, I'm not talking about 20 or 40 years. I'm talking about 5 years at the most, I'm guessing. And at that point, all bets are off. We'll have to see what comes out of that.
So several things there. One, you're very right about the political divergence between men and women among my generation, Gen Z. Effectively, the war between the sexes has devolved to such a point where men and women have become distinct political classes. Like, in the same way that you can imagine, like the workers and the bourgeoisie, we've just split the human species down the middle, which is, just a lovely state of affairs. But one of the things that I've noticed, and this has been true, I even see this speaking to, millennials, one generation older than I am, that there's been sort of this speciation where effectively either you are getting married young and having a lot of children, or you will never have children. Or maybe, you wait till you're 40, you have a child who's a little bit scrambled, and then you end up transing them, to be blunt about it. That trend has continued apace. Additionally, one of the other things that has been kind of and this has been a more recent story, has been the disenchantment of younger right-wing voters with the Republican Party in particular, which is really interesting. So you have, Donald Trump saying affordability is a Democrat hoax, which is not the best branding, to put it mildly. But what you have, and I count myself among this, is a large group of men who were doing everything correctly, right? Who got, good grades in schools, wanted to do what you were supposed to do. And at multiple points have been told, largely for their, their race and their sex, you need not apply. And so, especially people younger than me, I see this, where it is, the straight A student, captain of the football team, student body president, all-star, and he's going to a third-tier skate school because it's the only thing he could get into. Now, obviously, look, college placement isn't the end of your life, but that is a leading indicator of problems we see elsewhere. And so what you've created is a group of young men who effectively have very little to lose. There's not a way for them, even if they wanted to index with the system.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, like I have a job on the internet. This is what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Do I do it because it's fun? Yes. Do I also do it because there weren't a lot of other prospects? 100%. And there is an alternate world where if I were
Mm-hmm.
20 years older, I would have got a corporate job and never said anything at all controversial.
Exactly.
And so to me, that destabilization, where the things that traditionally tie men into a culture, the ability to, pair off with a woman, to own property, to have a stake in society, is being taken away at the same time, whether you want to call them neocons or, other pejoratives, are losing their magic, right? They no longer have the institutional control they used to. Let's also be honest. I mean, look at just the difference between Bill and Urban Crystal. The second gen was nowhere near as impressive as the first. And so to me, I completely agree. I think that the short-term prospects are very dim, but in my mind, the fact that you have that sort of civic religion of the American empire as regards Israel, as regards, foreign wars, is very clearly falling apart. I mean, look, like, obviously I'm, no fan of, Fuentes in particular, but the fact that a figure as radical as that has become fairly successfully mainstreamed. If you're a neocon, we'll put that in scare quotes, things are not looking good for you. And so to me, I do find that to be sort of a slight note of encouragement. I mean, look, like I'm not exactly an optimist by personality, but I think that there are interesting things happening. And look, like, I'm sorry, I'll finally wrap this up. But part of the big reason that I started using my face, this was fully anonymous for a long time, is that I saw a real chance at a resistance. I saw a real chance at a dissident movement that was going somewhere, that was serious. And the people that I have reaching out to me behind the scenes, or who I've met at different conferences and events, are serious, capable people.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you could be doing something else, and you're doing something dangerous to your social standing or your job prospects to be here. Yeah. And look, like, they're always early adopters of, any idea. And the first prophets of whatever the rejection of the American empire is were sort of burnt at the stake. They were the first out the gate, and many of them got punished for it. Yeah. But as with any other idea, it ramps up quickly. It becomes popularized to a point where you can't simply throw everyone in jail or get everyone fired for their job if it is a position shared by a large percentage of the public. Anyway, Jim, I'm keeping you too long. It was fascinating to discuss.
No. Can I just briefly comment on what you said, though? Because
of course,
you're right. I mean, obviously, we do have the split in what used to be the mega movement between, let's say, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Nick Fuentes on one side, and the MEGA movement.
Mark Levin and others,
Loomer and Ben Shapiro. Some people think, with Trump in now, this is going to continue. J.D. Vance will serve 2 terms and all. I don't think it's going to go that way. I think it's more likely this is all, the wheels are coming off this already, and the left is going to come back. And you're right. You got more and more young men whose prospects in the normal sense, getting married, having a family, having a real job, are not all that great. And they're starting to wake up to their situation, which is very, very socially dangerous, especially since there are no political or economic outlets for that increased energy and awareness. You're looking at some kind of an explosion in the future. They have to be aware of that. Our rulers have to be aware of that. So what do they do with it? One way is, how do you dispose of lots and lots of dangerous young men?
You get the Russians or the Chinese to do it for you.
Yeah, you get a war. Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, that's the direction things are going. And that, by the way, not to get too conspiratorial, like, again, I don't know what you think about this. I do think the 2020 election was stolen. And the question is, why wasn't the 2024 election stolen? Oh, well, because he was just so popular, they couldn't steal. No, he was allowed to win. And he was allowed to win because if we're going to have a war, we're not going to have a war with a bunch of trannies, foreigners, and feminists to go fight the war. We needed a bunch of dumb, white, Christian men from the South and Midwest to sign up because they're fighting for America against the commies. We can mobilize people of your generation for patriotism, especially with the right kind of false flag. And I look again. I think I'm not saying it's coming, but that's a distinct possibility, I think.
Well, I mean, look, I've certainly had the same thought. Thankfully, the sort of stupidly named Operation Midnight Hammer seems to have resulted in, no further action there. But the first thing on my mind when, I saw the same social media posts everyone else did, tracking the jets, was, I hope there isn't a bomb in New York City, or I hope there isn't, a nuke in Dallas. Look, like I don't know if I have the maximal 9/11 conspiracy theory, with holograms and all that, but at the same time, you look at, the Gulf of Tonkin, what may or may not have happened with the Maine, what seems to have likely happened with Pearl Harbor. These are not good people, and they're more than willing to, practice a little bit of dishonesty to get what they want. One more thing, and I just wanted to mention this, and we'll finally wrap this up now that we are well and truly over time, is to your point about, increasing radicalization on the right. It's important to remember that the exact same thing is happening on the political left. Look at the Charlie Kirk murderer. Look at the kid who, took a shot at Trump, who, to give Tucker credit, he did some very, very good reporting on that, digging into what this character actually was. There is a whole, basically there's sleeper cells buried across the entire nation of mentally unwell, effectively lunatic sexual degenerates who have been told for the past 10 years, that you need to, become part of that great anti-fascist crusade and, pick up a rifle. And so it's funny. I read a piece from Wired on my show not too long ago, talking about, in glowing terms, of course, the armed transgender movement. And in it, they're sort of showing their hand, talking about like, yeah, we really expect there to be a years of lead. It's like, oh, okay. Well, I guess you can just say that as long as they're draped in a rainbow flag, and it's completely all right. But yeah, I think that, and you can even see this in the reaction to ICE, right? Where you have, 12 guys in an L-shaped ambush outside an ICE facility. You're like, okay, well, that required a certain degree of preparation and support. And so to me, the prospect of increased political violence is almost a surety. But Jim,
if we do have a third civil war, it's not going to be boys in blue and gray and neat lines shooting at each other. It's going to be more like Bosnia or Rwanda or something like that.
And again, for what? Well, Jim, we are well and truly over time. This was a ton of fun. I'll have to have you back on. You mentioned your book, but where can people buy it if they want to do so?
They can get it at on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, any of those sites, or at lulu.com. There's where the printer is. And, any of those is fine. And they've got my little picture here on the back with Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul. So,
You got your bona fides. Well, again, this was a ton of fun. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. If you want to support the show, because this is what I do, you could throw me a few bucks on Patreon, Gumroad, or Substack. You'll get the episodes early with no ads. Again, Jim, it was great talking to you.
Thank you.
Everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.